To begin this discussion on free speech and the epistemic regulations, let's examine the father of liberal expression, John Stuart Mill. Unlike some contemporary philosophers to be named later, Mill believes in the epistemic value of nearly every type of speech, especially the speech which we disagree with. In Chapter 2 of On Liberty and the Subjection of Women, he argues that all speech has some value to its owner and even more to the truth. He emphasizes how dangerous assuming infallibility can be for the truth, by essentially stating that we can never be sure that we are wholly correct, as there is more to the truth than what we currently understand. He then goes on to say that it is the duty of the government and citizens to form the truest opinions as possible, and to never force these opinions on others, unless they are absolute that their opinion is close to the truth, and only in instances where opposing opinions are dangerous or malicious. He posits the idea that once these truths are reached, they should be argued and discussed so as to better understand opposing ideas and how to refute them. Perhaps the most important part of the chapter and book is where he makes the observation that no wise man has ever become wise without discussion, conflicting ideas, an open mind, and the consolidation of various truths. He then lists one of his main problems with the restriction of speech, which is that it requires an epistemic arbiter. He gives the example of the Catholic Church, who for years allowed only the elite to read and teach heretical books which opposed the Church and pointed out the flaws and fallacies in their teachings. Put into a modern context, this would prevent citizens from viewing opinions seen as wrong, which would eliminate the possibility of discovering a more complete truth or disproving something held to be commonly true. His problem with this is simple. An epistemic arbiter is granted far too much influence over the masses and could use this influence to push a single agenda or ideological belief, which would undoubtedly be a disservice to the world as a whole. Now that we have a fairly competent view of Mill's views on this free speech in the 19th century, let's look towards Greg Lukianoff's freedom from speech for a more contemporary view. In his words, epistemic humility is the ability to give opposing ideas a fair hearing, reserving judgment, tolerating opinions that offend or anger us, and recognizing that even the most repugnant of ideas or ideologies may be at least partially right. To finish the chapter, he posits the idea that throughout the world, people are coming to expect intellectual and emotional comfort as if it were a right, not a privilege. To begin the second chapter, he attributes the aforementioned comfort we've come to expect as a result of the comparatively nonviolent culture which we live in. He espouses the idea that as technology progresses and as our lives become easier, we'll become more and more sensitive to discomfort, whether it be intellectual, emotional, or physical. Additionally, he points towards the mobile society we live in, which allows citizens to live in places that correlate with their ideology and lifestyle, as a culprit of polarization, radicalism, and the allure of echo chambers, which are all certainly degrading to the freedom of opinion and speech alike. Citizens have become intellectually lazy and no longer search out opposing views so as to fact-check their own, according to Lukianoff, which is, in itself, a comfort given by mass media, the internet, and mobile societies. Lukianoff sees these comforts as dangerous because the only way to decipher truth is by criticism and the evaluation of ideas which conflict with your own. He states that it's an impossible pipe dream to believe that one can check and argue ideas without being offensive in some way, but that offensiveness isn't always a bad thing. A landmark statement which reaffirms all these prior ideas is the following: whichever portion of the political spectrum values care above all else will be more apt to sympathize with those they view as vulnerable, thus trying as hard as possible to provide them with as much protection as possible, leading to the specified faction being much more likely to label opposing or offensive truths as hate speech. While Lukianoff's work certainly has a few more great points regarding trigger warnings and censorship on college campuses, we've covered all the pertinent information pertaining to free speech and its epistemic value. Instead, let's now consider the arguments against free speech and epistemic freedom. To begin our examination of the opposing beliefs, let's take a look at Joel Feinberg's moral limits of the criminal law. Perhaps Feinberg's most compelling argument against free speech begins with the section Offensive Nuisances, where he lists several stories of increasing offense to try and discover the line where freedom of expression ends and harm begins. He continues to ramp up the level of offense, keeping only the setting the same, which is the inside of a moving bus. He ventures into topics of disgust, humiliation, religious shock, racism, and taboo. All the while, the implied theme is begging the question, at what point does expression no longer deserve freedom? Feinberg then points out that most, if not all, the examples given are not harmful, but certainly have a valid argument for their censorship. He infers that because nudity and public coitus are illegal due to their tabooness, so too should racism and extreme hate speech. Feinberg then goes on to describe the way which one feels when offended by something repulsive or taboo, listing the various accompanying emotions. However, he does acknowledge that these emotions are subjective and may be felt in various levels of degrees. He then states that forcing someone to unwillingly feel these emotions is an invasion of privacy due to the fact that actions which infiltrate one's peace of mind force them to cope with the aforementioned emotions, whether they want to or not. He seems to pose a paradox which goes as follows. Restricting speech is a restraint on autonomy, but by forcing others to cope with the actions and speech allowed by freedom of expression, you're restricting them of their autonomy. He then transitions into the next section by stating that it is up to the legislature and Supreme Court to strike a balance between the two freedoms of autonomies. To begin this section, he states that in order for an action upon speech to occur, there must be a standard of universality. In essence, nearly all people of all ideologies, races, and religions must find the action or speech offensive in order for any legal retribution to take place. He then gives his personal formula which he believes speech should be mediated by. For starters, the intensity and duration of offense should be weighed, as well as the ease in which the victim can avoid such offense and whether the victim willingly assumed the risk of offense through curiosity or anticipation of pleasure. Next, the proportion of citizens affected by any action should be considered. The higher percent of those hurt or offended, the greater need there is for sanctions. Lastly, he remains realistic by expounding his opinion that the more sensitive and fragile a person's psyche is, the less protection they can expect to receive regarding speech. Together, these form what Feinberg views as the necessary factors to consider when restricting or persecuting speech, and ultimately are what transfer offense into harm. Moving on, let's now view a more restricted perspective towards speech and epistemic freedom. In Brian Leiter's essay, The Case Against Free Speech, he paints a picture of 21st century America and argues that with the current state of affairs, our country needs an epistemic arbiter. He states that epistemic regulators are needed to censor what speech is necessary and acceptable, as well as what is heinous and worthless. He compares these epistemic regulators to the judges within courtrooms who decide what evidence or information is pertinent to the discovery of a truth. Unlike many historical philosophers, he sides with the view that unfettered speech has no value in our society. While this may seem harsh, he may have some validity to the claim, as he describes in the next portion of the essay. To reinforce the idea that our society is a dangerous one, he addresses what he believes to be the major inconsistency in our Constitution, which is that our courts are censored so as to determine the whole truth, while our society is free to spread falsities and lies as we please. Just as Leiter believes epistemic freedom is harmful to society, he believes individual autonomy is just as big a degradation to our country and should no longer be held at the forefront of our country's interests. He then looks towards the free market to paint a picture of how autonomy has skewed and misled our individual wants and needs. As we become more comfortable with the excess and security which capitalism fosters, our wants become needs and our true needs become an afterthought, as most people don't have to worry whether or not their true needs will be met. As he makes this point and disparages autonomy and independence, he contributes the process of socialization we undergo as evidence that the humans are innately non-autonomous. He believes that we are all simply an amalgamation of predisposed ideas and are not capable of being self-deciding because our very character is derived from outside forces and influences and not our own conscious originality. He labels this as a type of groupthink where we look towards other people and groups to decipher what ideologies are acceptable and will not be negatively judged. He defends this idea by denoting the fact that the internet is nothing more than a proliferation of useless speech which invites an echo chamber of radical ideas where people readily congregate to affirm their opinions and accept any statement which coincides with their opinions, regardless of truth. Leiter then states that the issue of epistemic arbitration boils down to one question. Can we confidently develop a mechanism for the regulation of such speech with regard to maximizing its epistemic value and minimizing its harm to others? His answer to such a question is no, this goal is not possible within a democratic capitalistic government. He states that there is too much bipartisanship to clearly decipher truths and too many private news companies with no consolidation of truth. Instead, democratic reformation is necessary. To end his essay, he leaves us with 4 conditions which must be assessed when establishing epistemic regulations, which go as follows. The epistemic quality of major media, the effect of cognitive biases have on decision-making, the range of effect that statewide propaganda has on human conceptions of basic and non-basic interests, and the extent which citizens are able to evaluate epistemic authority of different sources of information and analysis. Together, these help give us an idea of how much epistemic freedom we should or shouldn't have. Now that all the sides have been considered, let's examine who I believe makes the most compelling arguments for or against free speech. When it boils down to pure arguments, I believe John Stuart Mill and Lukianoff's arguments hold more reason and logic than Leiter and Feinberg's. While all authors do a fantastic job of outlining their beliefs with an equality argument, Ultimately, I don't believe the argument for speech restriction has as many benefits as free speech itself. In fact, Lukianoff and Mill refuted nearly every counterpoint offered in opposition to free speech, with two of the most prominent being as follows. In Leiter's work, he mentions the desire for an epistemic arbiter who controls what can and can't be debated, allowing for only the current facts. However, Mill pointed out how dangerous arbitrating forces can be with the example of the Catholic Church, who withheld information from the masses out of safety concerns. In Leiter's proposition, he is assuming the arbitrating force would be non-partial and moral. It is the polarity and caustic side of society which deems arbitration necessary. Immorality and corruption know no bounds, meaning that the arbiter could easily become polarized and push an agenda of facts which hold no value, similar to Big Brother in George Orwell's 1984. Additionally, the system which he condemns is the same system which allowed Martin Luther King Jr. to protest the racism and discrimination rampant throughout the country. Had there been an arbitrating force, his protests possibly would have never been successful. The system that allows caustic hate speech and discriminatory policies also paves an avenue by which the same policies and ideologies may be dismantled. As for Feinberg's piece, he spends a majority of the essay establishing a line where speech becomes harm. And while some expressions and actions are certainly harmful and require restriction, I fear his solution formula allows for too much discretion, which will lead to discrepancies in offense and harm depending on the ideology of your geographical location. Essentially, harmful behavior in California and harmful in Oklahoma would be held to different standards, leading to different punishments for the same act. I believe Lukianoff had the better solution in that exposure is key. The more we are exposed to painful or offensive material in a controlled, academically conducive environment, the more apt we are to successfully cope and move on when faced with these materials in everyday life. Just because something hurts you doesn't mean you should run from it. Instead, it is much more admirable to stand up to the actions and let it be known that trivial opinions have no effect on your well-being. As long as there are positive emotions, such as love and happiness, so too will there be hate and anger. We would be better suited to address these truths rather than spending an eternity running from them, as ignorance was never beat by ignoring the issues. While some restrictions on persistent, threatening speech is necessary, we should use caution when determining how much speech we limit. To conclude my assessment of the arguments, I will leave on this quote from George Orwell. Threats to freedom of speech, writing, and action, though often trivial in isolation, are cumulative in their effect, and unless checked, lead to a general disrespect for the rights of the citizens.